We are going to finish up Module 6 with web development. Unit 11 is styling web pages with cascading style sheets. In Unit 10, we learned how HTML provides the structure and the content of a web page. So while HTML allows us to organize information, the pages that we created were fairly plain. In this lesson, we'll learn how CSS allows us to control the appearance of those pages without changing the HTML itself. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain what CSS is and why it's needed. You'll create an external style sheet, link it to an HTML document, use several basic CSS selectors, and apply some common formatting to it, such as colors and fonts and spacings and borders. Finally, you'll use the CSS to improve the appearance of an existing web page. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheet. You can think of HTML and CSS as two separate but related technologies. HTML provides the structure and content of the page. CSS controls how that content is displayed. And a good analogy is building a house. If HTML is the framing, the walls, the doors, the windows, then CSS is the paint, the flooring, the furniture, the decorations. The structure of the house remains the same, but the appearance can change dramatically. Separating the content from presentation also makes websites much easier to maintain. So large websites have hundreds of pages, and one CSS file can style every page. Without CSS, every page would use the browser's default fonts and colors and spacings, and all websites would look pretty similar. But style sheets allow developers to create visually appealing websites while keeping the HTML simple and organized. Another major advantage is consistency. So a single style sheet can control the appearance of an entire website. If a company wants to change its colors or fonts, the developer often only needs to modify a single style sheet instead of editing every single web page. So this slide demonstrates the impact that a style sheet can have. Both of these web pages contain essentially the same HTML content, but the page on the right has been styled with a style sheet. Notice the improved colors, the spacing, typography, the overall organization. CSS doesn't change the information. It changes how the information is presented to the user. There are several ways to use CSS, but the most common one is an external style sheet. So there's an HTML file and a separate CSS file. If you notice the link element inside the HTML document's header section, this tells the browser that the linked file is a CSS file and where to find it. So when the browser loads the web page, it reads the HTML, then it loads the CSS file, and it applies all those style rules to the HTML elements. Keeping a style sheet in a separate file makes websites a lot easier to update and maintain. So this diagram shows what could be a simple website folder. There are several HTML pages all referencing the same style sheet. So instead of repeated formatting on every one of those pages, the style sheet is stored once in a separate file. If you change a color, a font, a spacing rule inside that style sheet, every web page that uses that style sheet is automatically updated. So let's break down a CSS rule. Every CSS rule has three basic parts: a selector, a property, and a value. The selector identifies which HTML element will be styled. The property specifies what characteristic will be changed, such as color or font size. And then the value tells the browser what setting to apply. So learning this basic pattern is the foundation of writing CSS. So element selectors apply a style to every occurrence of a particular HTML element. For example, if we create a rule for paragraphs, every single paragraph on the page will receive that formatting automatically. This makes it a lot easier to create a consistent appearance throughout a web page. Sometimes we only want to style certain elements instead of every element of the same type. That's where classes are useful. In the HTML document, the class attribute is assigned a class name. In the style sheet, the class selector begins with a period followed by the same class name. Notice that the class name is important in both the HTML and the CSS file. The only difference is that in the CSS rule, we place a period in front of the class name. That period tells the browser that we're selecting a class. Multiple HTML elements can share the same class, allowing us to apply the same formatting to several different parts of a page. Classes are commonly used for highlighting important information or creating reusable formatting styles. An ID selector is similar to a class, but it's intended for a unique element on a page. In the HTML document, the ID attribute is assigned a name. In the style sheet, the ID selector begins with a pound sign or a hash symbol, followed by the same ID name. So, just like class, the name title appears in both the HTML and the style sheet. The difference is that the ID selector begins with a pound sign in the style sheet instead of a period. IDs are intended to identify a single unique element on a page. Here are several CSS properties that you'll frequently use. So color changes the text color. Background color changes the page or element background. Font family selects the typeface, and font size controls the size of the text. Margin and padding create spacing, while borders draw lines around elements. So these basic properties are enough to make a significant improvement in a web page's appearance. So let's talk about styling text, because text formatting is one of the most common uses of a style sheet. Notice that the CSS rule changes the font, the color, and the text size without requiring any changes to the HTML. So this is the original HTML. And now if we attach the CSS file, notice that heading 1 changed colors, the font size changed in all of the paragraph tags, and the font family changed to caveat. Oops, I may not actually be able to read that, so let's change it to Aleph. One of CSS's greatest strengths is that a small number of rules can affect many different elements throughout a web page. So background color helps organize information and improve readability. So we can apply a background color to an entire web page or to individual elements. But you want to be careful to choose colors that provide sufficient contrast with the text so the page remains easy to read. So I think we'll move this back to light yellow. So there's often confusion about margins and padding. So padding is the space inside of an element between the content and its border. Margin is the space outside of an element, separating it from any neighboring elements. And a border helps visualize the difference between these two types of spacing. So we're going to start with a class selector called box. We'll add a background color and border to it so that we can see it. Now, the div tag stretches across the available width of the page by default. So we can add a width property to let us control how wide the box should be. Next, we'll add some padding. Now, remember, the padding is the space inside of an element between the content and its borders. Margins are the space on the outside of an element that are separated from its neighboring elements. So hyperlinks can also be styled using CSS. In this example, we change the color of a hyperlink from the traditional blue to a red. A second rule uses the hover pseudo class. When a mouse pointer moves over a link, the appearance changes to provide visual feedback to the user. It's kind of fun, and it creates a more interactive browser experience. So this example brings everything together. I'll provide the HTML and the CSS files in the description of this video. You'll notice that the HTML document provides the structure and the content, and that the style sheet controls the appearance. The finished web page is what the browser displays. And you'll notice that the HTML remains relatively simple, while the CSS provides the visual presentation. So beginners often encounter a few common problems. The style sheet may not be linked correctly, the file name may be misspelled, semicolons or braces might be missing, the selector might not match the intended HTML element. So if your web page doesn't appear as expected, check these common mistakes. It will usually help identify the problem. And ultimately, you can shut down the browser and you can shut down the editor that you are editing both the HTML file and the CSS file, and then go back to the same common spot and then double click on the HTML file to open it up in a browser, and then right click on the HTML and the CSS files to open them up in a text editor. Sometimes the browser will get a little bit confused about which file that it's looking at. So we introduced cascading style sheets and we learned how they work together with HTML. You learned how to create an external style sheet, connect it to a web page, and use several types of selectors and apply common formatting, such as colors and fonts and spacings and borders and hyperlinks. Remember, HTML provides the structure while CSS controls how that structure is presented to the user.